Hi, I'm Machiavelli, and I'd still wreck Thorin at Quake, and I'm welcoming you to Thorin's YouTube channel.
If you say hello, I'd say sup. If you say which way is my career headed, I'd say sup. If you ask me where I source my caffeine, I'd say sups. Gamer Sups. 10% off with the code Thorin, Thorin, at gamersups.gg. Buyer warning, will not make you as witty and entertaining as me, but might perk you up a little bit. Maybe you'll take in some more information and you could sort of be a simulacra of what I am. Look up that word. So when it comes to mouse pads, mouse mats, whatever you want to call them, you actually probably be shocked if you're a modern day casual fan, how much evolution there was over the years and how the industry took this circuitous route through different types of mats, and certain ones became de facto and the standard and better, but then suddenly it would invert and the old standard would come back and be developed in a new way. And it was a way for people. I mean, in the 2000s, people were buying tons of these as each new product came out, in the hope of obviously being a better player like the top players, and it became sponsorship items for the players, much as you'd imagine in tennis, the racket and the shoes, and in other sports, the cleats and the soccer trainers and all that jazz. Well, boots, I guess, in terms of actual football players. So an interesting thing I thought I could do is I'm going to show you with pictures some of the key iconic mouse pads, mouse mats that came out over the years, and give you a sense of how it developed from being just something that was whatever your mouse pad is, to you want a very specific one, and to this is the best one and we know this is the best for gaming. So at the beginning of when mouse mats came out, you basically had these generic mouse mats like this, where it was just made out of cloth, usually like a type of foam, and this top part where it's the cassette part there is a sort of like part fabricy, slightly plasticky print that goes across the top like a very thin layer. And basically the premise is this just came free with your PC. You would get a generic, like it would always be about this big, and then the idea was it would just have a different design on it. In fact, the main way people changed mousepad or mouse mat was something like your company that you worked for had one with their design on, or you might buy, first of all, if you buy a PC, it might say Gateway or Dell or something, or Microsoft or whatever. Also, you might get it as a free gift with a magazine or something like that that'd have their logo on. It was just something that people could market and put their logos on again. And at the time, it had nothing to do with performance in games. This mouse pad, this mouse mat basically, is just to make what at the time was a ball mouse correctly operate. You move it along, the ball moves, that's where the sensor gets the information, and it moves the cursor on your screen. Obviously, you can go right back to the original, the Xerox stuff, and Echo Park and all that, and the original IBMs, like the first GUI that was also using a mouse and a mouse mat, etc. It was fairly similar concept. At the time, this is just the most generic tech possible. So in the very, very, very beginning of esports in the late 90s, this is what people were playing on. The mid-90s, if someone like Thresh was playing in Doom or something, he would be playing on one of these. There weren't big special mouse mats at the time. But after that, still in the world where a mouse mat is just like that, you then got people who figured out though, but certain mouse mats, even of this type, are better than other ones. And so probably the most famous original iconic mouse mat in esports competitive gaming was also a cloth type pad, similar size, just a small one back when, obviously, by the way, people's sensitivities were much higher in the game. Even mouse movement as an element of FPS was fairly new. Obviously, in games like Doom, it wasn't relevant at that time, and you couldn't look up and down, etc. It was Quake, that was fully 3D. So this wasn't a big deal. It was starting to develop into it as these games became competitive. So then you got what is called the Allsop Raindrop mousepad. Now, this is just a mousepad, by the way. In fact, even until I think about the 2010s, you could just go in the UK to pretty much any PC world, just normal PC shop. They would sell this pad. And at the time, they hadn't even figured out, even then, that it had become huge as sort of niche interest in the gaming scene, particularly Quake, interestingly enough, especially the first Quake. And what happened, and a lot of Quake 3 players used it as well. Basically, if you had a ball mouse, it could even work with laser, but ball mouse especially, this was just the best pad. Because what made this different from the other one is it doesn't have that plastic coating part on the top. It's all cloth, and then it just has a very fine, sort of super fine mesh. That's what the raindrop part over the top is. And the cool thing about this one was it was a really satisfying feel on the bottom of your wrist and a very smooth feeling across the top. You didn't feel like you were on plastic. You were on cloth, but it also wasn't harsh cloth like you find later with the fatality pads, etc., where it's a bit thicker. This was like, it had a nice glide to it, and it was smooth. And so a lot of people really liked this particular pad. And in fact, this is one I myself used until like, 4 or 5 years ago when I just decided to get a giant pad. And in fact, in the modern day, if you're an old school fan of these, they sell it as a giant fatality DKT, SteelSeries, QCK heavy type giant pad if you want one for the low sensitivity. So this became very popular. I think people like Doomer and got Timber and guys like this, Blokey, a lot of the classic players were using this, and even in the 2000s, it used to almost be sort of like a way of showing you were an old school hardcore player if you had the Logitech Pilot or MX300 type mouse, and then you had one of these mats. It showed like you're old school, you are a legit guy. And this became quite famous, but as I say, it wasn't developed for gaming in that sense at all. Like, also had nothing to do with esports. In fact, I think they missed a massive trick. If they'd have understood, they could have flexed into this and even sponsored a few people. They could have sold loads more of these because they were very cheap. These were like a few pounds, a few dollars. They were not expensive at all. So then you came from there and you went from cloth to the first plastic, and plastic became the big thing. And this was revolutionary because obviously you go from these soft pads or softer, and suddenly you've got this hard, this is really hard plastic, but there's no give to this. This almost feels like a little chopping block or something. In fact, that's one of the downsides, is on the bottom part, it actually might like be a little bit more, take time to get used to it. It's also going to be cold compared to the cloth pad, but this became a big thing. This was the Everglide. And what was good about this, though, is unlike the other mouse mount, remember the downside of a ball mouse is when it's on cloth, it is going to pick up little fibers over and over again. And everyone knows eventually it starts to get so that when you move a certain bit, suddenly it like gets stuck or it like moves a little bit too much, and you have to take the ball out of the mouse and you have to literally like take all the lint off and rub it and get it all off. Well, on a mat like this, where's it coming from? Yeah, in theory, hairs and fibers from your clothes are going to get on, but it's going to be way less. And so initially for stuff like ball mice, this was next level as well. A lot of people switched to this and were trying it, and a lot of Quake players were getting into it as well. And this seemed like it was a big jump up, like it was going somewhere. And it started, this wasn't the one that really kicked it off, but it started the move into plastic as eventually becoming the default of what top pros were using and what people were trying to get sponsored by and all that jazz. And a lot of Quake players in the early 2000s started on this pad when they switched from the original cloth pads that they were using. And this comes then to obviously what was at the time the king of this division of harder / plastic mats, which was of course the iconic fUnc 1030, particularly this one on the left, the one with like the sort of, I'm colorblind, so sort of like, what is it, like a navy or a purple or something with like the orange outside. Now, what's interesting about this is it had a few factors. One, it came in this big steel case, as though it was almost like some sort of a luxury item. Very clever idea, because it made you feel like, oh, this isn't just a mouse pad. Like, I'm sort of like, this is a pro gamer's pad. And then also, what they had was, this had two sides. And so the reason there's that little orange part around the outside is that's a plastic part that holds in the that's like classic plastic that holds in the like frame of the piece of plastic that's actually the pad. And what you do is you can take that out, flip it over, and it has a different side. So I had a rough side, which I think is the side you can see here, and the other side was in theory a smooth side. Now, as far as I know, almost nobody used the smooth side. It was all about the rough side, because again, this was a different type of mouse pad, right? A cloth pad is more about like, it's like it's got a little bit of sort of like, you have to get it going because you have the initial push off, but then after that it's going to be smooth, right? The idea on this is it's about traction, it's about some grip. Like I can feel exactly where it's moving across, and people really enjoyed this because they could sort of keep more control over it, they felt at the time. And then also on this, you'll notice at the top left, that is a little plastic clip which operated, this is back in the day before mouse bungees were a big thing, as essentially a mouse bungee. You put your wire through that, and as a result, you can imagine it coming in the left, there at the top left of the screen, and then looping round and then down across the pad. And that's the way you could hold the mouse wire like that, so it would stay in position and you just move like this, because back then no one was using wireless mice. Obviously they were very, very unreliable even when they first got invented until a few years ago. And so that was a cool little extra detail. So it had the vibe of you're a pro gamer if you have this. Like, this is what the top players are using. And I can tell you a bunch of top CS pros in the early 2000s, people like Heaton, etc., were using this pad. 2001, 2002, this was the pad everyone was using, NIP, a whole bunch of people. And so it really became big actually within esports. And people started buying this as well as copying Heaton's config or what mouse he uses or how he shoots the gun. People also wanted the mouse pad. Now, the dual side aspect was interesting too, because it was the idea of like maybe you want a different style for a different type of game. I never really found what the point of the smooth side was personally. As I say, people thought it gave you more control. And this is actually a key point specific to Counter-Strike, because you notice when I was talking about the other mouse mats, I was mainly talking about Quake. By the way, things like StarCraft don't matter. Like, people didn't really care in the early days about like how could you set up posts for StarCraft. They thought like whatever, you can just do it with whatever. Hence why people could just be in a PC banging cafe in Korea and just not even care about what the mouse and the mouse mat is and what the ping is. It was a very forgiving game in that sense. But in games that are these precision, twitch muscle fiber, FPS games, everyone wants the little extra edge out of their game. And so the perception was in Quake, an all-around game, you usually have to move a bit quicker, be able to do 180s and 360s, and do these slick movements. And you've got different types of gun. You've got the machine gun, but then you've got the real gun, and they've got the lightning gun. So because you have all these different aiming styles, people wanted a little bit speedier, and they didn't mind the smaller mouse mat. It could be cloth, etc., the first hard ones. The perception with this type of pad is, first of all, it's a little bit bigger than the generic pad, and then also, because it's got this traction element to it, it's a bit firmer as you move it, and you can really feel everywhere you're moving. The perception was in a game like Counter-Strike, where there's a lot of spraying, this was a really good aspect to have for a mouse mat. I would even say that's a key difference people miss about Counter-Strike and Quake, which is why the old debate of like, who's better, who has better aim is like totally misunderstood, because the point is, Quake-style aim is the gamut of aiming. It's like prediction with grenades and with rocket launcher. It's tracking with the lightning gun, but with a little bit of a lag. It's hit scan, and obviously the plasma. It's hit scan if you're using the machine gun or something like that. So you have to do all aiming styles. Counter-Strike, the majority of the weapons are just hit scan, and often you're shooting at long to medium range at times, whereas in Quake you're almost never doing that except with the rail. So as a result, being able to do tiny micro movements or repositions or track someone completely in certain ways is the main skill set of Counter-Strike. And so these pads became very much in vogue. And then this started, like I say, not just plastic, it then kicked off into people thinking, well, what other hard sort of surfaces could we do? And there was a hard pad revolution. So whereas early on it was all cloth pads, then we went from the Everglide to the fUnc to now we come to another one on the way to the most famous one, which is Ice Mat. Now this was one where, as you can see there, it looks like just a piece of glass, right? It was a piece of plasticky / glass type stuff. And you would genuinely, that's what you would put the mouse on and move across. Now remember, we're still often using ball mice here, because certain it wasn't lasers, optical was in between laser and ball, if you don't know. And certain optical mice, the problem with these ones sometimes is it would depend what optical mouse you had. It might not always work, because obviously like the light could refract through it or something, or bounce off it. There could be issues. But if you could get it to work, if people wanted, again, this was more like you don't want as much traction. You're all about smoothness. Now the idea is your hand's going to control it, and you just want it to be as smooth and frictionless. The key word in this era was frictionless for this style of pad. That was a different type of hard pad experience. Some people they didn't want the grip of the pad. They wanted it to be as smooth as possible and to have no friction, unlike a cloth pad, definitely not like an Everglide or like the fUnc 1030. And this became in itself kind of it was more of like a cul-de-sac. It just, for a while, people were into it. I don't even know if these are sold anymore, but it did not become a big thing. This was sort of a side route on the way to a very famous type of pad, the steel pad. And it was like the surface of the fUnc 1030, but I would say like it's a much thinner pad. It also had two sides, smooth and hard. And it was more like the grip was a little bit better, I think. But at the same time, it also could be quite smooth to move across. And it was so thin, it had almost like, you almost felt like, whoa, this is like super technology, like this is designed for gamers. And this is a pad, by the way. SteelSeries was heavily sponsoring people like Team 3D, SK Gaming, the best teams in the world. And so loads of people were using this, Moto, Rambo, Cage. I think Cage mainly used cloth pads, actually. A lot of players, Heaton, etc. Loads of them were using this type of a pad. And this is where it was at the time. People were loving this. And interestingly, with this hard pad revolution came another switch, which is people who wanted the frictionless element started, because the bottom of your mouse always has those things on where the feet are. They would actually put tape on the bottom of those feet to make, because obviously the feet themselves over time, especially with the hard pads, would like wear down and wear away, and eventually you wouldn't have much left. And even worse, you get an uneven experience as you play. So you practice it a bunch, but then technically the mouse feet are changing, and thus your feeling of the friction between the mouse and the pad is changing as well. So in the competition, it's slightly different to what you were playing on before. So people want a consistent experience. They started buying these things called mouse skates, little tapes you could just put on the mouse feet. I've even heard, by the way, of some people who went way too far. Like if people know a guy who briefly was in SK Gaming, he was in the team that won with, I think they came third rather at CPL Winter 2002, the one that Team 3D won. A guy who was a Danish player, I believe, called Bengen. He was either Danish or Swedish. Could actually have been Swedish, to be fair. I think he was Danish for some reason. Basically, he was the guy who was an IDDQD who had a good run at CPL also, if people know who I'm talking about. And this was the guy where he actually used to legitimately spray onto the bottom of his mouse feet, like a sort of silicone spray that would put a small layer over, then he'd play on it. Then before the next game, he'd also spray on again and do it. So he was going for the most crazy frictionless thing and trying to make it all about this unique style of aim. So I never went that crazy myself, but like you see, everyone was trying to find a little edge from the tech side of the equation. So then after that, you came, and by the way, as an aside, I even once looked into this myself. I contacted some guy at some like tape making company in the UK, and I was asking him all these questions about fibers and what causes like less friction and what's the cheapest to produce. And he was giving me all these interesting answers, but the problem was at the time you'd have had to make like some crazy custom order to get all this stuff made. So then we came along. Here's the interesting thing. Along the back route of all this going on, there was a type of pad that already existed around this time, but it's just that it was the big push of pro gamers that brought it back into the public consciousness. And this is, of course, the thick, really big cloth pads with the vibe of the old days. And so I've got a very interesting story. The most famous one is the fatality pad, the fat pad, right? Now, the reason this was genius is not only was it the first mouse pad just custom to one pro gamer, and at the time, fatality. By the way, the Michael Jordan of esports, but you know, people said that about Thresh too. Just fatality did more. This was the gamer with all the big sponsorship, and he had his own mouse pad that's custom to him. Now, the reason it was a genius idea, by the way, is because this wasn't like he contacted some company and they gave him a tiny little bit of money or some just like retainer and then sold a pad with his name on it. This was not only the mouse pad that Fatality used, but he used it before it was even sponsored by it, because basically this was a pad that you could just go to like a PC shop in America, just a really big PC shop. And it actually, because it was so huge, began as a pad you bought to put your printer on top of so that it doesn't make like a mark on the table. You put your printer on top of this pad, and also obviously it's going to remove some of the noise and the vibration between the printer and the actual desk itself. And you would buy this, and it was very cheap again, and harkening back to the Allsop pad. So Fatality went and he would buy these pads for cheap, and he just wanted it because he wanted to have a really big area for his mouse. Because interesting thing about Fatality was, in Quake 3 especially, he used to use an interesting setup where he would have like a fairly high acceleration, so he could do like a 180 and flick and move around, but then he would have it so that the sense itself would be lower, so that if he wanted to like use a lightning gun, he could just like slow his mouse down, and then he was getting real precise. So he wanted a lot of room to potentially move around as he did this, depending on if he wanted to do slow or do quick. Whereas at the time, people tended to use not acceleration, and they used either like high sense and just lived with the problems of low sense, or low sense and lived with not being able to do a 180. Now, the reason this was genius is because it was so cheap to buy, and he basically just bought or got them to make a similar fabric and put his logo on, is I think they used to cost like $2 or $3, and then he would sell it for like $30 because it was a branding thing of like his. And he, by the way, it was really the pad that he used to win the world championship, to be the best player in the world, etc. So I actually thought this was a really cool idea. And then obviously Fatality was one of the biggest at the time. Someone in his sphere around the same time, they'd both been sponsored in the past, by the way, by the Razors of the world, was of course Destruct, DKT. He was bigger in Counter-Strike at this point in time. Originally, they were Quake and Unreal, respectively. And then the latter days, Fatality wasn't as relevant in Counter-Strike, but DKT did actually have a whole bunch of years in DOP and all those at RDW, all those squads you might remember him in GX briefly. And basically, he brought out his own pad, but what made his different was his was thinner than Fatality's pad, and I would say less grippy. It was a little bit slicker. His actually had like a surface that was a bit slicker, and you saw there eventually he partnered with Everglide, and this just became called the Everglide Titan by them, with giant mouth cloth pad. This was a very, very good pad in my opinion, not just for the size. It was a nice balance between some grip and a nice smoothness that when you move you have that nice inertia of the cloth pad, but at the same time nice for precision too. Also the actual slickness of the top of the pad I found meant it didn't catch as much dirt as potentially like a fat pad would, etc. The problem with these pads is they get quite dirty. The upside is you could in theory just wash them and then hang them to dry, and you could do that jazz in that particular approach. And these guys, remember, were top pro players in esports. This was quite interesting all in all, and also crucially felt quite nice on your arm, and you could put whatever direction. Like for example, I used to just put it vertically and have it as a thinner pad, but I could put my whole arm onto it and have it hanging off the desk, so I don't have that annoying thing on the edge of the desk where the pad stops and then this wrist is touching the edge of the desk, the corner of the pad, and then the top of the pad. Instead, it's like, why not have it come over and just have the same movement and feeling the whole way through? Then you came along. This was another weird cul-de-sac for a while, which was a Swedish company, a Nordic company, where it was Q-Pad. Now, this is going to look at first either like the generic pad I showed at the beginning, or you might naively think, oh, is this just like a cloth pad? This was a pad where it was made out of almost like a plasticky feeling. It felt like a tiny bit almost sticky to the finger if you felt it like that. Not sticky in terms of the mouse and get stuck, but just had like that strangeness to it of plastic. And basically, this was just another vibe again, and a bunch of Nordic players tried this and liked it. I was never really a big fan of this myself and the plasticky approach. Interestingly enough, they got quite big though, doing a lot of promotional material. They would do 1v1 tours where you would go and a bunch of pros and semi-pros would play against each other 1v1 and see who would win. Now, interestingly enough, as we found out, in Counter-Strike 1v1 means very little and the 1v1 aim map isn't very good. And so bizarrely, those tournaments would be won by people like Threat, who wasn't even known as like some mad skilled player, and he could beat people like Spawn or like Forrest or some Narsu, some crazy skilled player like that, because it was more about like timing and like, it's almost like rock, paper, scissors if you don't know aim map. A lot of it's like lock and how you just move around. So it's not really about like raw skill. It doesn't really show off aim that much. But famously, that was a big deal of what they were doing at the time. And so then you came to what is going to be the last big type of mat I show you. But I think this was the final evolution of where like cloth pads went to. And from here on out, it's mainly just been most people seem to use a cloth pad. And now it's not as big a deal. It's not like when SteelSeries just ran the whole industry. It's not like when the fUnc people came in early on and all these like niche ones. Now, it's not really even associated. It's like, what pad do you use? No one really cares. They're all pretty good now. There's loads of the cloth ones. So obviously the most classic one was the SteelSeries QCK Heavy. I think the QCK was just a plastic pad. This was the heavy one, was the cloth one, which again, I would say this is like one of the better evolutions of what you were doing with the fatality pad, with the DKT pad. By the way, I still have a lot of affection for the DKT pad. I think it's a great mouse pad in general. And actually, I've used the QCK Heavy myself many times when they've been given to me for free by SteelSeries. It's a very good mouse mat. Again, it's big, it's rectangular, so you can choose to have it horizontally. You can put it vertically. I did it wrong with there. Horizontally, vertically. You can choose whatever way you want it that way. It's quite thick. The top part's got a little bit of a mesh again, but it's got that like plastic, that cloth, like you can push into it a little bit if you want, but the mouse doesn't go crazy on it. And I feel like you get pretty good control all in all. So you had these eras in time. I'd say in the middle of the 2000s, like you were like, you could be a hard pad, you could be a cloth pad, you could be a soft plasticky QCK pad, you could have the weird glass plastic ice mat, people had mouse skates and all this. Now, an interesting detail to point out as well is obviously I tried to track as games changed in esports, as mice changed in esports, you see the evolution, as sponsorships changed and teams had sponsorships, you were now getting paid to use that pad. These were other factors to consider, whereas at the beginning, people are just using a pad because it's their favorite pad, or they happen to win on it and they saw someone else use it and they like the look of that pad. So believe it or not, mouse mats have changed quite a lot over the years and in quite interesting ways, and sometimes in response to market demand, and sometimes someone just had a cool idea, they put it out there and people just found out it was legit. Money doesn't grow on trees, and believe it or not, just watching a video for free with the odd ad doesn't really pay the bills. So thanks to the following people for kindly supporting my work and this particular content. And those people are, of course, Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Jensen Goh, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Thooorin, and a special thanks always goes out to Jerky's Minion, my main man. You know what? There are plenty of perks to be found on my Patreon. Like, you can find out who upcoming guests are for my reflections interviews and talk shows. You can ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Might get roasted if it's a bit spicy in how you phrase it. You can figure out which pieces of content I might want to do next. I often ask people which they think between certain ideas, offer suggestions. You can even take part in one of those long discussions with me about all kinds of esports, whatever's on your mind. So if any of those sound like something that takes your fancy, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skluminati today via the Patreon link in the description below.